Well, we're going to continue on with our various theses that John Shelby Spong is presenting. Uh, the earlier one that we just talked about was on atonement theology, and especially his critique of substitutionary atonement. It does so much. What it says about God and what it says about human beings just isn't very uplifting. It turns God into a bloodthirsty autocrat, that wants recompense for what was lost during the fall. It turns human beings into these guilt-ridden figures who are utterly helpless and can do nothing of their own. And Spong wants us to focus instead upon this idea, this is where we ended last time, that we are, in fact, incomplete people, that we also remember what he's trying to do here. He's trying to place um, human development in the context of evolutionary development. And he's looking at human beings as people who, well, as creatures who grew out of a very self serving, survival oriented perspective, that it's all about survival. And really, what he's proposing here is that one of the great tasks and one of the great vocations of human beings is to overcome that survival mentality that focuses on your needs first. And he's going to keep coming back to this throughout the book. And I think it's a really interesting, I guess it's a good way to look at what we might call the biological antecedents of of the human condition. What is wrong with this is not necessarily an original state of perfection that was lost by one person's disobedience in the garden and now must be won back by the blood of Christ. What's wrong with us is that just by virtue of our development, our evolutionary development, we cannot help but be self-centered creatures. And we cannot help but be power-oriented creatures, power over, right? So really what Spong's going to be doing in this is talking about two ways of being in the world. One of those is survival oriented, in competition with others for limited resources, everything that we would expect from the caricature of nature as read in Tooth and Claw. And the other perspective is appealing to the higher angels of our nature, as Lincoln said, the things that we are capable of by virtue of our own free will, exercising our will in such a way that we overcome some of the ego-driven desires that we have. And we're going to see this again and again and again. But this is consistent, as I said last time, with what was known as the Irenaean theodicy. This idea that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. The likeness of God was somehow lost in the fall, according to Irenaeus. But with the coming of Christ and the model of Christ, and Christ reuniting God and creation in the incarnation, it is now possible for human beings, through exercise of their will, but also through the help of the Holy Spirit, to achieve likeness of God. This theological perspective is very prominent in the Greek Orthodox or Russian or Orthodox churches in general, that theosis or God-likeness is a possibility for human beings. And I think Spong is drawing on that, going all the way back to the 2nd century in order to pull it out of, the deep barrel of theology that has developed since that time. So our next thesis, first of all, any thoughts about just that whole notion of human beings as incomplete instead of human beings as depraved and utterly sullied in their will? Spong's approach is certainly also influenced by the Enlightenment notion that human beings can hold truths to be self-evident, that by use of reason, we can arrive at direction and governance, for that matter, of ourselves, that we don't need necessarily to rely upon miraculous events coming from the heavens, or God's direction coming from the Bible, but that God imbued us with reason, and it is an exercise of faith to use that reason in good faith. And that is the so-called Christian heritage of our founding fathers, not the evangelical heritage that people would have us believe. Well, we did get into the Easter part last time, but I want to reread this thesis again, and note that this is the epicenter. Easter, the Easter event, is the epicenter of the Christian faith. Apart from the Easter event, we have only another Jewish reformer living in the first century who is trying to get people to, to understand God differently and to get along with people, right? But Easter, according to traditional theology, is what separates, it separates the Christian religion from all other world religions. And the way we have interpreted Easter, according to Spong, has to be revised. And this is the place where, if we had some other folks in this group, they might heartily object to some of the things that Spong is proposing. So I will try to represent him as well as I can here. The Easter event, according to Spong, gave birth to the Christian movement and continues to transform it. But that does not mean that Easter was the physical resuscitation of Jesus' deceased body back into human history. The earliest biblical records state that God raised him into what? Well, we must ask that. The reality of the experience or resurrection, that should be, the reality of the experience of resurrection must be separated from its later mythological explanations. The later mythological explanation is that Jesus returned as a human body and presented himself to the disciples. So Spong says, unlike the virgin birth, this is a tradition that's absolutely essential to the faith. But despite its centrality to the faith, there are a lot of inconsistencies in the biblical text on what exactly happened. The four gospel traditions about Easter, about the crucifixion and the Easter event, are, well, I wouldn't say wildly inconsistent, but you can see them historically developing upon each other. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, and Spong is going to talk about this in a later chapter, the early ending of Mark says nothing about women seeing Jesus and touching him bodily. They go to the tomb, and there's a guy, a young man, it says, in a white robe, and he says, "You're looking for Jesus. Why are you looking for Jesus among the dead? He has been risen. And go to your homes and go back. There's nothing here for you to see," right? And the early ending of Mark says, "And they left the tomb, and they were afraid, and they said nothing to anyone. They spoke to no one." That was the earliest ending of Mark. But if you get into Matthew, if you get into Luke, by the time you get to Matthew, you've got I think you have two angels there. By the time you get into Luke, it just develops, and it develops upon itself. By the time you get to John, you have Mary Magdalene trying to touch Jesus bodily, and Jesus says, "Don't touch me," not a very nice thing for somebody that you've been so close to and you haven't seen for a while, right? Especially if you've been down in the bowels of Hades. But don't touch me. This human body is not for touching right now. So what Spong is saying is, if we look at the record from the early writings of Paul, from about 50 to 100 of the Common Era, we see a mythologizing of the resurrection, something that was not early meant to be to be perceived as a resuscitation of a human body. Um, and any thoughts about that? I mean, I know that's very challenging. This whole idea of resurrection, I have to say, and I'm finding myself kind of uncomfortable every Sunday teaching this class on the one hand, and then standing up in church and professing what we believe, right? Talking about the virgin birth and talking about the resurrection, Jesus descending into hell, the Apostles' Creed. Spong is saying that that creed is a result of a lot of mythologizing that we need to now, in our current 21st century, set aside. I can't perceive that happening in the church.
Dan,
Go ahead, Denny.
I do a lot of humming through some of the phrases.
Say more, please.
Just kind of humming with virgin birth.
Yeah, I almost feel like I'm making fun of my parents here. There's so much about this theology that gave rise to or influenced who I am. But at the same time, the scientific view of the world has also influenced who I am. I wouldn't say I believe in science, but I acknowledge its efficiency in helping me to understand how the world works, how my body works, how I can explain certain events that happen that are often attributed to miracles. But this one on the resurrection, because it's so central to the Easter story, uh, it kind of is still a little touchy for me, even though, well, there's so much history that goes into resurrection that I'm going to get into when we get to the next chapter, actually. But it is a very Jewish idea. It is, ironically, the one thing about the Christian tradition, despite all of its influences from, Greek philosophy, and especially Gnosticism. You might remember the Gnostics believe that our human bodies are like prisons in which our souls are entrapped. Many Gnostics say this. And therefore, it's this knowledge, the special knowledge that will give us the key to unlock the prison door and allow our soul to flee from this world of decrepitude and, ascend to God and to be with God once again. That is something that the Jews could not abide, right? And when Spong talks about this mythologizing, you just absolutely have to put it in context. The emphasis on the bodily resurrection is an affirmation of the goodness of God's creation. The emphasis upon the incarnation is an affirmation of the goodness of God's creation. So there are benefits that come with this. But if you ask me to say, so Dan, you truly believe that someday you're going to, come back to life and you're going to have a body again? That just doesn't, I have a hard time believing that, you know. And so I've been conflicted about this my entire life. I do like what Spong has to say about, Paul's understanding of resurrection and how that early understanding comes to be mythologized starting at around 70 with the Gospel of Mark, but perhaps even before then. So any other thoughts about this? Because I really would like to, I don't want to offend anybody. It's a tough one.
Yeah, I guess I share some of the same kinds of feelings when I recite the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed, which is the one that we use in the Episcopal Church and all of that. Some questions about where I came from as a very, in a strong German Lutheran family. My parents were very, very strong in their faith, lived out their faith very well, but in the 1930s and 40s, rendition.
Mhm.
And that's where I was raised. I'm still, I give my faith growth development, my faith right now is based upon that foundation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And rather than humming, which I've done before too, or just leave out some of the phrases, daydream, whatever, some of what seems to make sense to me is that I've moved more in the direction of the mystical, contemplative approach to understanding all of this.
Mhm.
And are there truths out there besides scientific truths? Can we find truth in things other than facts?
Yeah. Yeah.
What about poetry? What about art? What about the great novels that are not true,
Mhm.
not factual, but boy, do they tell us the truth.
Right.
The stories, and what Spong says, the stories that we hear, if we examine them factually, they're not too reliable. But
Right.
behind those stories are truths.
Yeah.
And well, and I'll just stop there. But that's some of what I've done to try to get some of this together, and a lot of it comes from our doing icons together and a variety of things like that. But
Yeah.
anyway, what are the truths behind the stories?
Right. And I think that's where Spong is coming down as well. And the appeal to the mystical tradition we've actually been dealing with ever since we started reading this book. The idea of God as the ground of being, not God in some high heaven removed from earth, but God at the center of all, which presents the problem that Paul does, presents the problem like, well, where do we start with this idea of resurrection? Well, in the good historical critical method, we start with Paul. And what does Paul say? Doesn't say anything about a bodily resurrection, doesn't appear to know the stories about the women at the tomb. In fact, it doesn't, as you know, does not appear to know many stories about Jesus at all. What he does know is he had a powerful experience one day on the road to Damascus that's told 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles. And so we have just sparing references from Paul. And one of those is probably the most explicit, is in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, I'll just read starting from verse 1, what Paul says about the resurrection. Now, I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you also stand, through which you also are being saved. Isn't that interesting? You are being saved if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, unless you have come to believe in vain. This idea of being saved suggests that process, doesn't it? That that Spong is referring to as an incomplete people moving towards completion. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, last of all, as to one untimely born. I'm coming late to the game, he says. As to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. By the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me has not been in vain. So interesting, just what I read, compare that. He appears to Cephas, then to the apostles, then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers, and then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. What are your thoughts on that? Because it seems like it's very inconsistent. And compare that, I should ask, with what you know about the Gospels and that reading of Jesus' resurrection. Where are there inconsistencies?
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
the definition of the word appeared can be rather elastic, seems to me.
Right. And that is where Spong is going to go with this. But this is an example. In fact, the next slide, you're going ahead. You're moving ahead as you tend to do, or as we all tend to do sometimes. But Jesus appeared to 500 people, and this is he did it this way, then this, and then this. He appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to the 500, and then to James. Well, James is part of the 12, wasn't he? I mean, that seems kind of strange. James, if we're assuming is James, the brother of Jesus, and then to the apostles. Well, we always associate the 12 with the apostles, right? So how is he making a difference there? But all of this to say that, it doesn't appear to be a very firsthand account. It appears to be an account in which there is some sort of prioritizing and a developmental idea as to how Jesus appears to these people. And then Spong wants to ask the question, when Paul says that he was raised, Jesus was raised, and the passive is used here, not Jesus rose from the dead, as if it is an act of his will, but he was raised, right? Into what? Paul clearly says in Romans, in chapter 8, he was raised to the right hand of God, as if after his death was raised immediately to God's right hand. Well, people will say, well, that's true, but all of that was after the ascension, right? He was raised, appeared to the apostles, but then he ascended into heaven and sitteth at the right hand of God, from whence he shall come to judge the living and the dead. Paul doesn't say that, It's an immediate raising to the right hand of God. Yeah, Will.
Well, just to add to what Chuck said, I think it is helpful to me to think of searching for truth rather than scientific fact, as in you supply, but Moby Dick, Ulysses, My Antonia, as Peirce creation story. Search for truth.
Right. Yeah, and unfortunately, we've come to equate fact and truth these days, right? I think that's what Chuck is getting at. And then if something is true, we ought to be able to prove it by reference to the facts. And that is really a misunderstanding of the word truth. Facts are like two-dimensional things. They're things that occupy time and space, and can be tested, or they can be observed as recurring over time. But truth is something that transcends time and space. And this is where Spong wants to go with this. And this is the level on which Paul is living as well. He, as a Pharisee who persecuted the church, was, I don't want to create a caricature here, but he was a person who saw the world very clearly in black and white terms. As we might say, in very factual terms, this is what the law says, this is what, how things should be. No room for paradox in this, right? No room for inconsistency. You're either in Judaism or you're out of Judaism. But then something happened to Paul. Something happened in which he began to see an added dimension to that perspective. And he connected that added dimension, or maybe I should say, his experience of Christ went hand in hand with connecting that added dimension of his perception of the real world. The two of those went hand in hand. He began to see the world in a much more dynamic way. And this was a resurrection experience for Paul himself. And Spong is trying to say here, is this really what's going on? That what we're talking about here is people experiencing a new dimension of reality. Jesus, when being raised to the right hand of God, bypassing the bodily resuscitation, but being raised to the right hand of God, makes possible I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Jesus being raised to the right hand of God is being raised to a new dimension. And somehow that new dimension is open to us as well. This Jesus entering into oneness with God is open to us as well. And he comes back to my favorite passage in Philippians, and this is the Christological hymn. Philippians 2, verses 5 through 11. But just give you a little background on this. This appears to be one of the oldest affirmations of faith in the Christian tradition. If you were to read this in your Bible, you will see that chapter 2 is moving along quite nicely as a narrative letter, right? I'm telling you all of this. Then all of a sudden, Paul, it's like he's quoting, the lyrics to one of his favorite songs, right? You all could do that to one of your favorite songs, right? As Jimmy Buffett says, or whomever, I don't know, that would be one of your favorites, not one of mine, but, as the great songwriter says, and then he starts to quote the song, and in a nice meter. Well, this is what happens in Philippians chapter 2. Paul is writing to the Philippians, and all of a sudden he pulls this quote out, and it appears to be a liturgical quote that was professed in the church. Now remember, Paul's writing somewhere around 50 of the Common Era, and he appears to be drawing on a statement that was already in the common understanding or in common use among people in his churches. I'm going to read chapter 2. I don't want to ever be accused of proof texting, right? So I try to read long passages. I'm reading chapter 2 in Philippians, and I'll tell you where the hymn begins. If then, he's writing to the Philippians, if there's any encouragement in Christ, any consolation from love, any sharing in the Spirit, any compassion and sympathy, make my joy complete. Be of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Now, note the oneness and the compassion and love there, right? That's so important. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Oh boy, shouldn't we be hearing that these days? Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Or to put it in Spong language, overcome that survival mechanism that makes you focus on, power and looking after yourself first. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. And here the hymn begins. It's almost like Paul would say, like that song that we sing every Sunday. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Emphasis here on humility, right? Therefore, God has also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that in the name of Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. Exalted to the right hand of God, according to Paul here. Jesus raised to a new dimension. Is that enough to appeal to our sense of resurrection? Well, it's a good mystical start, isn't it? That the presence of God on earth, the presence of God in human form, Jesus taking on, this is Irenaeus too. This is the Greek Orthodox idea, not accounting equality with God as something to be grasped, but taking on to himself human form, a body, and thus raising all of creation in that created form to God once again, and humbling himself, even to death, in the most heinous death you can imagine, becoming a slave, if you're a doulos, a servant really to others. And thus, in that experience, being highly exalted. That is the essence of Paul's resurrection story, according to Spong. So, is that enough for us? It's very beautiful. In fact, I've always appealed to that. I don't know. There's something about that that reference in Philippians that just is very theologically sound to me and very beautiful. Any thoughts? Go ahead, Will.
Well, this may be too big a leap, but I'm thinking of Ann Phelps' singing sermon.
Yeah,
She said, "Sing love to the world."
yeah,
So that's what I'm thinking of.
yeah. And also her reference last Sunday to Rainer Maria Rilke's On Love and Other Difficulties, which is, I quoted in just about every class I ever taught. So I'm hoping that passed on to her, but it's the idea that, don't try to look for answers to questions too soon. The questions will remain, and one day, and learn to love the questions, and one day you will live into the answers.
And she said, live the question how.
Yeah, live the questions.
Live it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe someday you will come into the answers itself. But this is that leap of faith that's so necessary as well. Living questions doesn't serve our very survival minded orientation as incomplete people, right? It's okay to live precariously in that incompleteness. So Spong concludes that chapter in good Spongish fashion. According to Philippians that we just read, Jesus in the resurrection had not returned to his previous earthly existence, but has entered into the oneness of God. This is what Paul clearly understood the Easter experience to be. Thus, we must recognize that the founding story of the Christian story is not about either an empty tomb or the resuscitation of a deceased body. Its original proclamation asserted that in some manner God had raised Jesus into being part of who God is. Jesus was raised by God into God. Is that not quite different from what we have been taught to think over the centuries of Christian history? It's not that different than what we've been taught to think. It's just that we've had this little story inserted about a resurrection or resuscitation of a body, prior to this oneness with God. So any thoughts about this? Chuck, this is your mystical tradition. This is straight Orthodox mysticism right here. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, it's just fun to, it's just fun to read Spong these days.
Say more. You mean at this point in your life, or?
So anyway,
Well, I'm glad.
I'm looking forward to the next chapters.
But we still have to get through Paul's list of resurrection witnesses here.
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd just make the comment that, that gets kind of down to the basics when you look at the different accounts of the resurrection, and they are all different in their way.
Mm-hmm.
But it gets back to religion theology 101. The Gospels were not written to report facts.
Yeah.
They are in effect theology. And so it's not what they say, it's what they mean. And in that sense, there isn't that much inconsistency.
Mm-hmm.
They carry a consistent meaning of Jesus.
Right.
It's not a news report.
Yeah, of which we have many these days, some better than others. But you can see how difficult this is in our context, not to read the Bible as a news report. I'm just amazed at the number of people who say this is the most historically accurate book ever written, not realizing that statement itself is an affirmation of how clearly entrenched you are in the scientific worldview in which you live, that you're trying to turn the Bible into a book that can be scientifically proven. It doesn't make sense to me. So this idea of Christ appearing, this is where Denny was making the reference last time, this great Greek word ophthe, which is used in the Septuagint. Just a reminder that the Septuagint, when Hellenism began to be, really all that for the Jewish people living after the time of Alexander the Great, there were many Jews living in Greek-speaking territories like Alexandria, Egypt, who were losing touch with Hebrew. They couldn't read Hebrew and wanted a translation of the Old Testament or of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And so 70 scholars got together. This is where the word sept comes, or the root sept comes from in this word. 70 scholars got together and wrote their translation and translated Hebrew into Greek. And thus, when Spong makes a reference to the Greek word that's used in the Septuagint, he's referring to that Greek translation. It's helpful because knowing how those scholars chose this word helps us to interpret it for ourselves. So when Paul says that Christ appeared to Cephas and to the 12 and then to 500, the very word that he's using, ophthe, is where we get ophthalmology from, to make an appearance, right? To perceive, is the exact word that is used of the story of Moses, where God appears to Moses in a burning bush. Now, do we want to assume that God was seen bodily, or there was some sort of, revelation that happened in that. And of course, the revelation is Moses was given a new insight, right? And so how do we use that in this context? And I'm going to skip over the whole Joseph novella, but basically, Paul is trying to say, or Spong is trying to say, that Paul was given a new insight, that God, through Jesus, appeared to him, and after his experience, he saw the world in a new way. That's sufficient for resurrection right there. That somehow the life of Christ, in whatever way, appeared to Paul and gave him a new dimension for helping him to understand the world. He says this is entirely consistent with that story of second Isaiah. The prophets were completely enamored with this idea, especially the prophets in the south in Judah, with this idea that Israel, that the people of Israel, the Jews, the Hebrews, with their city on the hill, the temple to which all the nations would flock one day, and this very imperialistic idea of a king sitting on the throne in a very worldly way. This was the ultimate for them. And they were absolutely certain that God was going to make that happen, right? It was just a matter of time before God revealed God's self in God's people through Jerusalem. And by the way, I should probably mention, this is still the revelation that many are waiting for in Jerusalem today. But isn't it interesting that one of the people writing in the name of Isaiah had a completely new revelation about this? And you might remember that Isaiah was a prophetic book that was written over a time period extending from roughly 722 BCE up until about, maybe 500 BCE, about 225 to 250 years. Second Isaiah was written somewhere during and just after the Babylonian captivity. And this great miraculous event where King Cyrus allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem inspired Isaiah. And he had this great sense of, oh my gosh, we're going to return and everything's going to be wonderful. We're going to build that temple once again. We're going to have a king, and God's plan can start to evolve once again. But he got back to Jerusalem and just saw how completely and utterly devastated the city was, to the point where he lost hope, really, and fell into a great depression. There's no way we can come out of this. It's like rebuilding the World Trade Centers. It's just not going to happen, unless we turn the World Trade Center Plaza into something new, that represents us in a new way, right? Well, same thing with the temple. And Isaiah, had a vision after his depression. According to Spong, he had this vision that the will of God was not going to be achieved through the concrete means of the temple and a king, but the people of God, the Jews, as they were being referred to at that time, had a new vocation. And I want to read what Spong has to say, because I'm going to read quite a bit, actually, if you don't mind, because it's really quite beautiful. I'm right in the middle of page 180. When Isaiah emerged from his depression, he sketched a new vocation for Israel that was rooted not in victory, but in defeat, not in power, but in weakness. It forms perhaps the holiest writing in the Hebrew scriptures, The vocation of the Jewish people, he suggested, was not to win, not to achieve power or even nationhood again, but rather to live in such a way as to absorb willingly the world's hostility, to drain from people their anger, accepting it and returning it to them in love. Second Isaiah, had this insight and thus achieved a kind of resurrection himself. The servant, this is the suffering servant idea. The servant, a symbol for the nation, was to be a willing victim, one who would be rejected, despised, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, as in Isaiah 53. He was to make the people whole by accepting their abuse, never returning it in kind, but responding to it only with love. That ancient portrait, drawn by this unknown prophet, became the one which the followers of Jesus saw lived out in him. Now let's return to what Spong has to say about, our natural tendency to be survival oriented, right? When people hurt us, we want to hurt them back because that's what survival is all about. But the human vocation, with this new perspective revealed through Jesus, is one that's quite different. We return hatred with love. So difficult to do, and so difficult even to try to rationalize, right? Was Peter, I'm reading on, and I'm going to read the next full paragraph. Was Peter the first to see this? Was he the one who saw in Jesus a life driven not by survival, but by the love that enabled him to give his life away? Did this vision enable him, Peter, to see God in a new way, not as the Almighty One, the Heavenly Father, or the judge of the world, but as the source of life, expanding the early Christian understanding of what it means to live, as a source of love, freeing them to love beyond the boundaries and their fears without expectation of gaining love in return, and as the ground of being, there's our reference to Tillich again, giving them the courage to be all that they could be in the process, and in the process, freeing others to be all that they could be. Was this the vision of God that they saw in Jesus, who called people beyond the barriers of tribe, race, ethnicity, and gender? Was resurrection, and here's Spong's primary point, was resurrection the ability to see that Jesus had taken his humanity to a new dimension and had now stepped into the being of that which they called divine? Was it a step from self-consciousness into a universal consciousness, into an awareness of the oneness of all things? This is how Spong wants to see resurrection, this is almost Gnostic in a way. It's a new revelation, a new understanding of who we are in the world by means of Christ, by means of a revelation that Jesus is able to offer. This is how Christ appeared to Paul. This is how Christ appeared to Cephas and others, not through bodily resuscitation. So Spong hammers it home. Resurrection, I now believe, was not a physical act, not formally deceased. No formally deceased body ever walked out of a tomb. Resurrection was rather a moment of new revelation that occurred when survival-driven humanity could transcend that limit and give itself away to love, in love to others, including even those who wish and do us evil. This was the experience in which a new seeing of both God and life was born. Was this experience enough to be called resurrection? I submit that it was, Spong says. So I lay the question to you in the 5 minutes we have left. Is this experience enough to be called resurrection for us in the church today? And I was going to go a little bit into the resurrection for the Jewish tradition, but I'm going to have to start there next time. But let's just contemplate that question. and it's a question I've really been, asking you about all along. Uh, is it enough? Is it enough for you? Is it enough for our church? Everybody break in whenever you want.
Dan, I'm thinking in my own experience that for the vast majority of, congregations in the pew who ceased their theological curiosity at 18 from Sunday school
Yeah.
lessons and very simplistic, youth Bibles. Um, to me, it's very understandable that they would, not be interested in what we're talking about here.
Yeah. 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 But there's the safety of the known, right? As irrational as it may sound that a body comes back to life
Well,
implies that. Go ahead, Denny.
well, it's what they learned, it seems to me, in Sunday school, that were, pretty straightforward, this happened and the Christmas pageants and that, um, it's all pretty straightforward to them.
Yeah.
It's only when you start parsing all of this,
Yeah.
and I'm so curious about, if the later church leaders for the the subsequent 2,000 years simply thought Jesus was kidding in the Jesus story. It's almost like they'd never read, Paul and Mark and, Matthew and Luke and John.
Jesus was only kidding. That's why he was going to return, right? Come back to just say, I was only kidding.
No, I think they thought, the church leaders,
Yeah.
if you're really going for social control, and I never see that in the Jesus story. That's
Yeah.
me. Uh, and I guess it makes sense if you're trying to pull together, the disparate folks of Europe from second century to,
Yeah.
almost up to, the present day.
Yeah. And this is really where the anthropologists are going to come in, especially those who have been influenced by Marx. The social control aspect, control over life and death. And I think, that is a valid critique. I'm sorry, I skipped over here. Any other comments about this? Back to the question, is it enough to call this resurrection and move forward? Will, go ahead.
Well, I have another Ann Phelps quote, which is, I think she said this, you'll correct me. Questions are fuel for our faith.
Yeah.
So it's good what you are having us do
Yeah.
in Spong, which is to ask questions.
Yeah. Well, I think Spong is really asking the questions and then presenting answers he wants us to try to debunk, but Anne's perspective there is about as Presbyterian and Reformed as you can get, faith seeking understanding, right? Mac, were you going to jump in and say something, or did I miss that?
No, pretty much what Will was going to say, what Will has said. It's, to answer your question directly, is it enough? For me, it is enough. But I think for other people, it has to come from the leadership. And to Denny's point, Christian education, and it stops at age 18 a lot of times, before 18. I mean, once you've done coloring the coat of many colors in 6th grade for the 20th time, sometimes, that's the end of your Christian training, your theological training. But I think that's where it has to come from. In Spong's position, which I don't, I think it's important to characterize it. He wants change. I mean, he's the guy, as the cover of his book says, also the author of a book called why Christianity must change or die. And I
Right.
believe it's his thesis. Look, we can proceed along the road we're on, where 90% of the people in the pews today think that, it's the literal version. But,
Mhm.
you look 100 years down the road, it's not going to happen. It's
Yeah.
it's not going to be, it will be, all of it, unbelievable, unless a different interpretation can be placed on it that's non-literal.
Well, unfortunately, a different interpretation is being placed on it, and it appeals to the basest of senses, and that's Christian nationalism. That is my concern. Is nationalism going to replace Christianity? And I think it will, and unless, because there's so much adrenaline and hype that goes around it that people just get fueled. People are fueled by hate, apparently, that in such a way that love just doesn't quite foot the bill for them. So my concern is, yes, I mean, I think Christianity will die. If it doesn't die, it will probably turn into some form of a nationalism that just has this Christian veneer. Chuck, I think you're going to say something, and then we're going to have to be on our way. Is that right? Chuck? No. All right. All right. Good enough. I thought I saw you turn off your microphone. But anyway.
I don't think I did. I'm just pondering.
Okay.
My Richard Rohr meditation this morning had a phrase in it that said, we either live Jesus' life or kiss Christianity goodbye.
Relevant. Yeah. Very relevant here.
And he was responding to a large extent to our current political situation, which he hardly ever does in his meditations. He's much more contemplative and other. But anyway, today I thought he hit it spot on.
Yeah. Yeah. Richard.
Love or die.
Yeah. Very good at doing just that. So, well, everybody, I'm going to stop our share, and we meet next week. I think, well, it is the chapter that begins with Mark, the Gospel's understanding of Easter, chapter 24. And that's where we'll go. We'll start to actually look at what these stories say in the Gospels. And if you haven't made a comparison of those stories, well, we're going to be doing that. You'll find that they are wildly, well, I shouldn't say wildly, they all focus on a resurrection, but on the so-called facts, or the I don't want to say that either, the incidentals of the story, who was there and what happened, how many, was it a man, was it an angel, all of those things. That's quite different. So I will see you all next Wednesday.